The Nintendo Direct drought of 2020 was truly a dire, trying situation. So it should come as no surprise to anyone that when the first Nintendo Direct of 2021 was announced and then livestreamed shortly after, the internet was abuzz with discussion. I myself was excited to see that Pyra and Mythra were joining Smash Bros, and that Miitopia was getting a Switch port, something my co-host Bobbin and I frequently use as an example of something cool that would never happen. But I recall that the general reception to the presentation was a lot more mixed. The division in popular opinion got me wondering as to what made for an objectively good Nintendo Direct. Furthermore, was there a way to determine what the single best Nintendo Direct is? Well, you saw the title of this video, so obviously, the answer is yes. Shortly after the February 2021 Direct aired, I got to work devising a system that would allow me to calculate what the objective best Nintendo Direct is. After a day of design, followed by several more days of calculation, I had managed to score every single General Direct and rank them from best to worst. Satisfied with my findings, I presented them to my friends and put my ranking system to rest. That was until recently. The June 2024 Direct surprised nearly everyone by packing an end-of-life presentation that was expected to have slim pickings full of new announcements, seemingly giving one last shot of life to the dying console. Not since the E3 2021 Direct had I seen the internet so unanimously agree that a Direct was not just good, but great. This got me curious as to how the last few Directs fared in the rankings, and so I returned to my data, this time prepared to share my findings with you, dear viewers. And so, without further ado, I present to you all every single General Nintendo Direct mathematically ranked from best to worst. Before I get into the rankings themselves though, I think I ought to explain how I went about ranking these. I've noticed that often, Nintendo Direct discourse is dominated by the appearance of certain franchises or the absence of other franchises, and that whether a Direct is good or bad is determined by whether or not specific games showed up in it. It's hard to use this line of thinking to design an objective system, however, because in reality, everyone goes into these presentations hoping for different things. Maybe you only watch Nintendo Directs hoping to see Mario or Zelda appear. Maybe you're a fan of some of Nintendo's niche franchises, and go into most presentations hoping to see Metroid or Pikmin make an appearance. Maybe you really just want the Miis to make a comeback. My point is, going by series won't really get us anywhere. That being said, I think there are a few general points about these Directs that we as a fanbase can agree on to use as a base for this system. I think a fairly safe assumption to make is that for most viewers, first-party announcements take priority. If that wasn't the case, then people wouldn't be so upset every time a partner showcase was announced. As such, first-party games will receive the most points on our ranking system. Additionally, I think there is something to be said about the act of announcing a game in and of itself. While seeing more of games we already know about can be nice, especially for fans of those games, the main takeaways from most Directs tend to be the things we haven't seen before. Thus, new announcements will be held in higher regard than trailers for games we already know about. Following that train of thought, the pacing of these events becomes very important. The best Direct will have a ton of new announcements to appeal to as wide a player base as possible. Spending too much time on one particular game is actively detrimental to that goal. We have game-specific Directs to go into more detail. At the same time, we do want to be able to absorb what we're seeing, so the bite-sized trailers that appear in sizzle reels aren't of much help either. We want to keep the flow of the presentation going at a steady pace. Abiding by our guiding principle that a good Nintendo Direct is a presentation with a number of evenly paced new announcements, we therefore land upon this ranking system that allows us to assign each individual announcement a point value and accompanying multiplier, or multipliers if appropriate. 4 points for a new first-party announcement. This includes Nintendo-published games, meaning that things like Octopath Traveler and DC Superhero Girls both fall under this category. 3 points for a new third-party announcement. Also included under the 3-point banner are ports from the current or previous generation, since it's always neat seeing modern games run on Nintendo's outdated hardware, and Smash Bros. Fighter reveals, since even though they aren't technically new game announcements, they tend to generate the same amount of buzz. Ports of older games, that is, games from 2 or more generations ago, are worth 2 points, as are DLC content and free update reveals for currently available games. Each wave in an expansion pass is counted as its own reveal, meaning that one game's DLC can score 2 points multiple times, provided that the same content is not being shown off twice. Finally, for 1 point are non-game announcements, trailers for games we've already seen before, and games in sizzle reels. Somewhat frustratingly, sizzle reels often vary in content and format, so I was unable to pin down an all-encompassing definition for what qualifies as a sizzle reel. Ultimately, I had to go with my gut, so you'll just have to trust me on this one. For examples of what I counted as sizzle reels though, you can look at mass NSO game announcements and those bite-sized trailers that tend to be placed at the end of a Direct right before the final announcement. Now onto the multipliers. The first and final announcements of a showcase will have their scores multiplied by 2.5, as these are the trailers Nintendo wants to emphasize the most, and thus should be considered bigger announcements, for lack of a better word. If a game is a console exclusive or compilation title, its score is multiplied by 1.2, the former because it's in line with our first-party priority system, and the latter because it's multiple games in one, which can only be a win for the consumer. Note that console-exclusive compilations will receive both these multipliers, but straight ports of pre-existing Nintendo games will not. I realize that may sound stupid, but I designed this system 3 years ago, and the idea of having to recalculate every direct score just because I wanted to tweak things a tiny bit was too daunting an undertaking for yours truly, so we're going ahead with the system as is. We also have a couple of multipliers that can decrease an announcement score. If the trailer in question is an ad for a game that's already out with no new information to share, its score is multiplied by 0.8. It's worth noting that for data like release date or publisher, I will be referring to the game's North American version, as I am ranking the North American directs. This means that games that had already been announced or even released in Japan at the time of a given direct's airing will also be counted as new announcements if this is the first time the West is seeing them. Finally, in order to really emphasize the importance of pacing, segments that go on for too long will have their scores lowered proportionally. Segments over 4 minutes will receive a 0.8 multiplier, 6 minutes a 0.75 multiplier, and 10 minutes a 0.5 multiplier. Once every segment in the direct has gotten its points and multipliers assigned to it, all the points are added up to give the direct a total point value, then divided by the number of segments in the presentation to get a final score. With all of the rules of our system in place, we can at last get on to the rankings themselves. For brevity's sake, I will not be addressing every single individual direct. Instead, I will only be covering the 3 best and the 3 worst. You can rest assured that I did in fact rank all of them though. Both a spreadsheet with the rankings and a Google Doc with the script and all of the math will be linked in the description. Now then, let us begin with the 3rd worst General Nintendo Direct. June 3rd, 2012, the 3rd ever Nintendo Direct, is a bit of an oddball. Truthfully, I'm unsure as to why it's classified as a General Nintendo Direct, but it is, so it's included here in the ranking. This particular presentation is largely just a Wii U hardware showcase in anticipation of that console's release later that year. The only game in the entire presentation is the Nintendo 3DS's Swap Note, and that's not even a new announcement. Since there isn't really any new information in this presentation, every single segment only earned 1 point, the sole source of variance being a couple of added multipliers here and there. There isn't really much to say here, other than that it's clear that the Nintendo Direct format was still undergoing growing pains at this point, so let's just move on. That's right, the Direct that prompted this whole video ended up being the 3rd best on the list. What's particularly funny about this presentation is that it mostly coasts off of the back of what would traditionally be considered smaller titles. Among its 4-point announcements are the 2 Famicom Detective Club remakes, the aforementioned licensed kids game, DC Superhero Girls Teen Power, Mario Golf Super Rush, and the incredibly named Triangle Strategy. Splatoon 3 was probably the biggest announcement here for most people, though as I already mentioned, my 2 highlights from this particular showcase were the Miitopia port and Smash Bros. Fighter reveal. I had been hoping for Xenoblade Chronicles 3 proper, but as it turns out we would have to wait another full year for that to come out, so at the time I took what I could get. By November 2013, Nintendo had landed upon a somewhat more structured format after experimenting for the first couple directs, but unfortunately, most of the games featured in this direct had already been announced elsewhere. Back when the format was starting off, it didn't have a monopoly on reveals yet, quite like it does today, so despite the lineup of games being solid on paper, there are actually no new announcements here. Several first-party games make an appearance here, including several Mario games, Animal Crossing New Leaf, and The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds. But much like with the other bad direct we looked at, every entry here is only worth 1 point, so it really doesn't count for much. Most of the 4-point games from this presentation are actually 3DS games, despite the Switch being a year old at this point. The direct was split between 3DS and Switch announcements, with 3DS announcements including WarioWare Gold, the Bowser's Inside Story remake, Dylan's Dead Heat Breakers, and the Luigi's Mansion remake. Comedically, there was only one full new first-party announcement at this direct, that being Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, though it was backed up by the announcement of Splatoon 2 DLC and ports of Undertale and the Crash Bandicoot N. Sane Trilogy to Switch, among other things. There weren't very many segments in this direct, but most of them focused on things we hadn't seen before, which was the key to its success. And now for the worst direct. I suppose the old adage that the first is the worst holds true here, as the worst Nintendo Direct of all time happens to be the very first one ever aired. This presentation really does feel like a relic from the past. Though all directs are ultimately just glorified ad reels, this presentation really does just read like a series of 3DS ads, having no interest in new announcements and thus giving no oomph to any of the games showcased here. The game selection itself is weird too. Though Skyward Sword and Super Mario 3D Land do make appearances here, the majority of the direct is dedicated to showing off eShop games. Good eShop games, mind you, but eShop games all the same. And various applications for the 3DS. Perhaps the most humorous of these is the segment on the 3D animated short DreamWorks Animation's Thriller Night, where you can spend a glorious 30 seconds watching then Nintendo of America president Reggie Fils-Aimé talk about Shrek of all things. At just over 7 minutes, it's really no surprise that there isn't much to this event, being a far cry from the typical 40-minute directs we get today. And with the structure of these presentations having changed as much as they have, I get the sense that we won't ever get a direct as bad as this one ever again. Good news for us perhaps, but not so much for the inaugural Nintendo Direct, which is resigned to sit here at the bottom for all eternity, or at least until Nintendo stops doing these showcases. You may have begun to notice a trend, that the worst Nintendo Directs tend to be the earlier ones, and that the best are more recent. Well, the mathematically determined best Nintendo Direct is here to break the mold, being the last of 6 presentations aired in 2013. There actually isn't much to this Direct. It only has 13 segments, the 4 4-point games among them all being spin-offs, Hyrule Warriors, Chibi Robo Photo Finder, NES Remix, and Dr. Luigi. Regardless of the content of the games themselves though, having nearly a fourth of the games on display be new first-party announcements is what ended up launching this Direct to the top spot. I'd say they took a quality over quantity approach, though if I'm being honest, if you asked an actual person, I don't think anyone would choose this particular Direct as their favorite. Thankfully, we're not looking for the most popular Nintendo Direct, just the statistically most exciting one, so this Direct will remain on the top for the time being. Actually, much like the worst Nintendo Direct, due to the change in format, I'm not sure this presentation will ever be topped either. In order for Nintendo to have another Direct ranked this high, they would basically have to forgo all the third-party fluff, which seems unlikely in this day and age. Kudos to you then, December 18th, 2013. You win this round, even if you probably aren't remembered very vividly by any particular Nintendo fan. So there you have it, the 3 statistically best and worst Nintendo Directs. Now that we've determined what the objectively correct opinion is, I'd like to close out the video on a more subjective note, by going over my personal favorite Nintendo Directs. I think the first Direct I ever watched was the Tomodachi Life Direct from 2014, which actually ended up selling me on what is now one of my favorite games of all time. But I didn't start trying to actively catch them live until around 2017, 2018, so all the Directs I discuss are going to be from that point on. I think the first Direct that I really enjoyed on a personal level was the September 2018 Direct, where they announced that a bunch of PS1 and PS2 era Final Fantasy games would be appearing on a Nintendo system for the first time. I remember watching a Game Explain prediction video a day or two before, where John correctly predicted that 7 through 10, sans 8, would all appear at the showcase. Not only was it impressive how on the money he was, but, as I think they mentioned in either that prediction video or the discussion video afterwards, there was something cathartic about seeing these famously disc-based games appear on a cartridge-based system. Also, beyond all that, I think it was around this time that I started to become more interested in JRPGs as a genre. So I was definitely excited to be able to try out some of its more foundational text, so to speak. The next really noteworthy Direct for me would have to be the February 2022 Direct where they announced Xenoblade Chronicles 3. I played Xenoblade Chronicles 2 in 2019, and it was one of a number of games I played that year, all of which I hold in high regard to this day, that showed me that games could be cinematic experiences with complex and expansive narratives. It prompted a love for the series that was further reinforced when I played the definitive edition of the first game upon its launch in 2020, and I soon found myself eagerly anticipating the announcement of a third game so that I could be part of the fandom going into the launch of a new game. It helped that I managed to get a couple of other friends into the series a year or so before 3 released, so my friend and I popped off over text as we realized what they were showing. They also announced that Earthbound, my favorite game of all time, was coming to the Switch in that Direct, so that was a nice little cherry on top. For my final pick, I have to say, the most recent Direct really was fantastic. Even if not every game there spoke to me personally, like I said earlier, it was crazy seeing Nintendo pull reveal after reveal right out of their hat when everyone was expecting a sparser, more low-key Direct. I'm actually surprised that this one didn't make the top 3 with how packed it was. My suspicion is that some of the bigger announcements, such as the Marvel vs. Capcom and Ace Attorney Investigation collections, both of which I'm very excited for, being compilations of older titles, held back the Direct's overall score a little bit. For what it's worth, out of the 40 general Directs held thus far, it made number 10, so that has to count for something. Probably craziest of all, though, was that this Direct marked the return of the Denpa-men of all things. It was already wild seeing it announced at the Japanese partner showcase after the series had been dormant for nearly a decade, but I was so sure that it was going to stay in Japan since it wasn't in the Western presentation. Turns out, they were just saving it for later. Now, considering the state the game was released in, I personally feel that the fact it was translated barely made a difference, but you know what, it's a thought that counts. I'll take 2 niche Japan-exclusive games and some of my favorite series coming to the West no matter what the caveats are. To be completely honest, I'm sure I messed up with the math here somewhere. Not in the sense that I miscalculated, but more in the fact that I probably applied points and multipliers inconsistently. In my defense, trying to figure out when exactly a game was announced, especially when looking at Directs over a decade ago, was occasionally difficult. The lines between remake, remaster, compilation, etc. can be so blurry sometimes, and that's not even to mention the aforementioned issue with the sizzle reels. I'd also be remiss not to mention the role that BDG's Unraveled series and the Backseat, formerly Backseat Game Dev channel, both had in inspiring this video. Both of these are dead series that dared to ask, what if we used needlessly convoluted math to answer questions that nobody asked? And that was kind of the energy I wanted to capture in this video. I joked with my co-host Bobbin a couple times that I would call this video denatured to riff on the Unravel series. I've opted not to, but I still wanted to give credit where credit is due. Now then, go forth, and whenever the next Nintendo Direct comes around, and discourse inevitably follows it, you can always consult this handy-dandy ranking system to see if the internet is really right or wrong this time. Until then.